Our next topic today is on women's human rights, and I'd like to get started by introducing our guest. She is Helen Rubenstein. She is the Deputy Director, the Women's Human Rights Program at the Advocates for Human Rights.
That's right. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, well, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Can you tell us a little about your role with the Advocates for Human Rights Association or organization?
Sure. Well, first of all, if I could just say a little bit about the organization itself, and then I can say more about what my role is. The Advocates for Human Rights is a 30-year-old human rights organization based in Minneapolis, and we have a number of programs. We have a refugee and asylum program that helps refugees gain asylum in the United States. We have an international justice program that works a lot with the United Nations, has special consultative status with the United Nations. We have an education program, and I work with the Women's Human Rights Program. And the Women's Human Rights Program focuses on violence against women, primarily internationally, but also here in Minnesota.
So it's primarily internationally, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen here in the United States. And how much of that work do you do here in Minnesota?
Well, that's absolutely true, that problems of violence against women are epidemic everywhere in the world. And where what's sort of unique about our situation is that most of our work is on domestic violence, helping our partners in other countries get laws passed and implemented. And what we're able to rely on is the fact that Minnesota was one of the first places really in the world to address domestic violence, the first domestic violence law in Minnesota was passed in 1979. The shelters were, this was one of the earliest places that domestic violence shelters were opened. And so we certainly have not solved the problem of domestic violence in Minnesota, but we have a lot of experience here that we're able to share with our partners throughout the world.
So what's a good day within the organization? What are your goals, or what are you looking to accomplish when you're talking about advocating for women human rights?
Mm-hmm. Well, really a good day for us is when we have worked with a partner, and just to give an example of work is in January we released a monitoring report on implementation of domestic violence legislation in Mongolia. We had made 3 trips to Mongolia doing fact-finding, and we went back in January because it's not cold enough for us in Minnesota to release the report. And to release the report, we had a meeting at the Parliament. There were about 100 people there, including high-level government officials, parliamentarians, and our report was very well received. And now there are amendments to Mongolia's domestic violence law making their way through the parliament, and they include many of the recommendations that we made in our report. So we feel like we've really accomplished something when we see our work having an impact like that.
That is quite an accomplishment. But I'd wonder, so like the country you just spoke of, Mongolia, would they see that? Is there ever any resistance, I guess? Because why is this organization coming from the U.S. telling us what to do? Can you speak a bit about that?
Sure, and we get that question all the time. But the way that we work, we only go where we're invited in. So we work with a women's organization in Mongolia who has been doing this work for many years, and they are very happy to have the assistance, and also to come in as a human rights organization and have a kind of objectivity is also welcomed. But you're right that in a lot of places, we might go in somewhere, and especially if you're talking about the people that are responsible for implementing the laws, their initial reaction may be, well, that's great for you in the United States or in the West, but that's not how we do things here. We have culture and traditions and, religious reasons that won't work here. And our response to that is that we work from a human rights perspective, which means something very specific. There are human rights treaties that most of these countries have signed on to. They've said that they're going to do certain things to protect women. They say they agree that protecting women is going to take priority over whatever their cultural practices have been. And so we're there to kind of hold their feet to the fire in a way and say, you said you would do this, and here are some ideas about how you can actually implement what you agreed to do.
How do you get the word out to them so that you do get invited in?
Well, most of our work is in countries in Central and Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union countries. And so a lot of it has been word of mouth. We've been working there for 20 years now. We've done 24 reports there. And we're very well known there and have a lot of credibility there. And one thing that I would say about that is when we started working in that part of the world 20 years ago, which was of course right after the fall of the Soviet Union, none of those countries had domestic violence laws. Now most of them do, and we've been involved in helping them get those laws passed and implemented. And interestingly enough, one of the few countries that still does not have a domestic violence law is Russia.
It's amazing to be able to see that kind of impact of your work. But you were saying in some of the places there's the cultural norms or religious norms that sometimes can contradict the basic human rights of women. So now they have the laws in place. Are women feeling empowered to report offenses? Are they feeling like if they want to escape a domestic abuse situation that they have somewhere to go and they will be heard and it won't be backlash?
That is such a great question, because getting the laws passed is just the first step. And often if there's just a law and it's just sitting on the books, for a woman to try to access the protections under the law can put her in greater danger if the police and the courts are not gonna enforce the law. So one of the most important things that we do is training of legal professionals. We train police, prosecutors, and judges on how to implement the law. And the way that we do that is that we bring those professional experts with us to do the training, so it's not a bunch of human rights lawyers telling these people how to do their job, but their peers. And it's such an exciting thing because the trainings can be truly transformational. That at the beginning of a 3-day training, the people that we're training sitting in the room are making those same objections that we've just been talking about. Well, that's great for you, but that will never work here. And by the end of the training, they see how they can use it there and how they can go back and talk with their colleagues and start putting this into place. So the training is just a really extremely important part of what we do.
And let's talk for a second about Minnesota. And as I read the work pre this discussion, again, it brought it back to, well, why should we be concerned about human rights and women's issues in Minnesota?
Well, because we have the same problems here in Minnesota as every other part of the world, and we have not solved the problem of domestic violence here. We certainly have not solved the problem of trafficking, which has gotten a lot of attention in the last few years. In 2008, we published a needs assessment for the state of Minnesota on sex trafficking, and that report actually served as the basis for a number of legislative changes that have happened over the last few years. And the one that is on most people's minds now is the Safe Harbor Law, which means that that juveniles can no longer be charged as criminals or delinquent But even before the Safe Harbor law was passed, we drafted legislation and advocated for laws that created tougher penalties for traffickers and for their customers. And really all of those pieces need to be in place to effectively address the problem of trafficking.
And is that having an impact? So even when you say the tougher, the tougher outcomes for the customers, is that happening, and is that making a difference?
It's beginning to.
Okay.
We're starting to see some actual prosecutions of Johns, which is new. We're seeing prosecutions of traffickers, much more aggressive prosecution of traffickers with much more severe penalties. So yes, it's starting to make a difference. It's a process. It takes a long time, but I think we have a very heightened awareness now of the problem, that people no longer think of prostitution as a victimless crime, that the women, and in most cases young girls, are not doing it because they're happy hookers or little vixens or whatever the stereotypes are, but that they're victims.
Right.
So
Is human trafficking still on the rise yet still? I mean, have they hit that level? Is still on the rise?
it's increasing everywhere. I mean, one thing I would point to is in North Dakota and Montana, in the oil fields there, it's a huge problem where, with the man camps there.
Yeah.
So where, there are always new situations arising that are going to create opportunities for more trafficking. And so it's something that we really have to continue to address and see how it raises its head in new and different ways.
So you talk about writing legislation and making changes so there's different penalties. Is that because there's now new knowledge and information about the role that human trafficking or prostitution has on their victims? Or have there been opponents, when there's legislation that's passed, opponents that say, you know what, I don't agree with that language in that legislation, I'm not going to vote for that? Like, do people really dispute any type of legislation that's going to be presented to protect women in any of those crimes?
Well, I think in our Minnesota legislature, I don't think that we have active opponents that at least are public about it. But internationally, yes. In fact, one of the major human rights organizations in the world, Human Rights Watch, just came out with the position that prostitution should be legalized. So, and that's very distressing that they don't see the victimization angle of it. So, yes, there definitely are people in the world that think that that it may be a problem, but the problem is not what we see being the problem.
Thank you for all the great work you're doing, and we appreciate you being on the show with us today. It's been very informative.
So much information.
Yes,
Wow.
it is. So many more questions.
I
to
know.
ask,
Yes, there
right?
are.
We're not done, but
Just
we
tap
are
the
done.
surface.
Yeah.
Well, I'd be glad to come back
All
anytime.
right, well, we'll take you up on that.
Okay,
All
great,
right.
thanks.
Well, Junita and Nadia, thanks for being on the show with me today. It was a pleasure, as always.
Great to be here.
Thank you,
All right.
Alli.
All right, and we thank you for being with us today on It's a Woman's World, and we hope to see you next time.